All right. It is the week of Christmas or the week of December 19th, 2022. And this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger. And today is the end of the year 2022 Big Business Extravaganza episode. That's what I'm calling this. It is the final episode of the FBP for 2022. And first off, just want to say whether you're a first time watcher listener or you're a long time watcher listener, really appreciate the support this year. By far the best year the podcast has ever had. Very excited for things coming in 2023 that I will speak more on, hopefully Q1, Q2 of 2023, but just been an amazing year. And especially despite other things I've been dealing with, this has been a huge anchor for me. And I cannot thank all of you enough for your support. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. With that out of the way, I know this episode is coming out at a wonky time. It's partially because of the holidays and work, and then fun still not being in my office, which on YouTube you can tell if you're listening. Trust me, still not in my office yet. Contractors, gotta love them. But we have so much to cover on this episode. First, we're going to talk about the Ali Act expansion to MMA, which is being reintroduced. We have to break that down from several different angles, including what promotions and fighters can do if this act did somehow get passed and why this is coming back now. Because it used to be talked about, I want to say 2016, 2015, and all of a sudden disappeared, and now it's being reintroduced into the United States Senate. Why is that happening? Well, we'll break that down as well. Then we're going to talk about Rizin versus Bellator. They've got a stacked card on December 31st coming up. It's going to be amazing, hopefully, fingers crossed. But still not a ton of coverage for it compared to, say, a UFC Fight Night card. Why is that? Well, I'm going to break down why, as well as talk about branding and marketing and how that affects and really shows the dynamics of the players in the MMA space. Then we're going to do quick hits, then a fan question that I didn't get to on last week's pod about pay-to-play journalism, which I think is very interesting. Want to make sure I tackle that. Then we're going to talk about good deal, bad deal, that the UFC is once again raising their pay-per-view prices starting in 2023 to $80 a pay-per-view. What's the thought process behind this? Is it a good call? How's it going to affect pay-per-view buys? I'll break all of that down. And finally, we are going to end this episode with the predictions for 2023 of the biggest business moves or business happenings that I think will happen come 2023. So with that in mind, like, subscribe, bell notification if you're on YouTube, if you're on Stitcher, Apple, Spotify, what have you, share as much as you want, or just, say that you like to listen and let me know. I would love that as well. But love you guys as always. Timestamps at the bottom. Let's go ahead and dive right in. All right. First thing we need to talk about today on the podcast is a tweet from Nathan Quarry, former UFC fighter, that states, breaking, just got word from @RepMullen, so that stands for Congressman Mark Wayne Muller from Oklahoma's 2nd District, that he's looking to reintroduce the Ali Expansion Act from the Senate side of things in 2023. So I would assume their Senate side of things, he's talking about the United States Senate, even though Congressman Mullen is in the House. But nevertheless, that's a very big deal if that is true. I know Trent Reinsmith sent a follow-up tweet stating he reached out for confirmation on that. We haven't heard any true confirmation yet, but I trust Nathan Quarry here. He's generally on top of things. He's been involved in this process of the Ali Expansion Act or just MMA fighter rights for quite a while. So I'm assuming he knows what he's talking about here, and I would trust him as a source. This is a very big deal, a very, very big deal if it's reintroduced and if it is passed. Now, what the Ali Act expansion would do, or Ali Expansion Act rather, in terms of the details on what that would do, I will give you a high level and I will direct you to a place where you can get a really in-depth breakdown, because I've done a breakdown of it a long time ago, and John Nash, of course, Mr. MMA Business himself, did a fantastic video on it pretty recently talking about how the Ali Act would really just changed the landscape of the business. And he got into the details there at a pretty granular level. So if you want that type of level of detail, go check out his video. From a high level, what it would do is essentially hypothetically change the way that MMA business is done to mimic that of boxing, right? Promoters would be, governed by an independent body in terms of, assigning challengers for various belts and things of that nature. You'd have a whole new system where you could have several promoters create multiple titles, and then you would have independent bodies saying, hey, you've got to fight this number one contender, mandatories, right? If you follow boxing at all, it would just shake everything up. From a fighter perspective, prelim fighters would probably get paid the same as what they are now. Maybe someone said a little less. Hypothetically, but I don't think that would happen. But then again, hypothetically, you could get less overall in the industry average, right? Because right now there's only a couple of big players in the space. This would open up a Pandora's box of new promotions that would create their own belts and own weight classes. And then you'd have most of the highest ranked fighters in the world find one to challenge a belt and make a bunch of money off of. So I would say prelim fighter pay, especially for the top 15 ranked guys, right, that aren't fighting for belts, but maybe are 15 through 13 or something like that, their pay would probably drop. Anyone that's fighting for a title or is a title contender, regardless of the belt and the particular promotion, that you're looking at far more money, right? Somebody like McGregor or Rousey or Adesanya or John Jones, you're looking at a bunch more money. If you're a champion right now, if you're a UFC champion right now, let me put it this way. This act gets passed and you're a UFC champion, you're jumping for joy because you're about to make a ton of money. Way more than you probably ever did under the UFC. Same if you're honestly a Bellator, PFL one, and any what you would call major promotions champion would be ecstatic for this to be passed because they will be able to negotiate a far bigger purse, bigger split of the revenue, right? Changes everything. You also then don't have these contracts where people are locked into, you've got to fight, with us for this amount of time and there's championship clauses and all this other stuff. You wouldn't have any of that. You would have so many other rules in place, contract length being one of them, where it'd be far, far reduced and allow someone like an Ngannou to easily get out of a contract they didn't like, or Paulo Costa, who's been complaining recently, right? He'd be able to get out of it pretty easily. He'd be able to sit out and wait, figure it out, and then maybe go challenge for a belt, make a lot more money. There are so many things that change if this gets passed. And again, go watch John's video for the details on that, because he, of course, killed it as always about that stuff. With that in mind, that high level overview in mind, I want to talk about A, why this was reintroduced now, B, what the likelihood of it getting passed is, in my opinion, and C, what promotions and fighters could do to kind of anticipate this being passed in the short term, long term, all of that stuff. So, first of all, why is this getting reintroduced now? Well, politics are everywhere, right? And MMA is an industry where that's not an exception. It's no secret that Donald Trump and Dana White are very close friends. And it's no secret that the UFC has lobbyists who are paid a lot of money to help keep the UFC's interests top of mind for both the House and Senate, right? With Trump being in power and having the kind of grip he had on the Republican Party from 2016 through really just the past 6 months or so, it started to really be troublesome for him after the midterms, but even before the midterms, you could see it kind of slipping. With his hold on the Republican Party, Rep. Markwayne Mullin, who originally, is a Republican and talked about introducing this back, several years before Trump and was a big champion of this, probably shelved it, right? Was probably told in no uncertain terms, hey, you know what? We're going to shelve this because Trump doesn't want to hear about it. The optics of Trump and Dana, right? Trump coming to UFC 244, Dana doing the Republican National Convention and the speech for voting for Trump in 2020. You don't want to put forth legislation that would hurt someone that is clearly a friend and probably big donor to Trump's campaign and an ally for him in the sports world. So my guess would be is that's why it was shelved, right? We didn't hear anything about the legislation for the past 4 or 5 years. I know people asked about it, got no comment. And I think that's pretty much due to Trump's and Dana White's ties. Makes sense, right? Makes perfect sense. Also ties to the NLRB and their decisions with Leslie Smith, right? Different administration, different priorities, and different politics you have to navigate. With Trump now announcing his candidacy, but having the House committee just recently bringing a suggestion of possible charges to him, or having the DOJ referring to the DOJ that they should investigate him for particular criminal charges, plus how he did in the midterms and the rise of Ron DeSantis as his political opponent. Trump's grip on the party is fading. At least most would assume it was fading. And now I would assume that Rep. Mullin feels it's safe enough to reintroduce this, especially, again, I don't know the internal politics here, and I'm not condoning one side or the other in U.S. politics. That's not what this podcast is about. But I would not be shocked if this is also somewhat of a move where if Mullin were to back the DeSantis branch of the Republican Party right now, this would be a way to take a shot at Trump or help take a shot at Trump, right? Because this legislation does not help the UFC as a business. In fact, the biggest loser if this legislation is passed is by far and away the UFC. So we'll see if it actually gets reintroduced, right? Right now, we just have a verbal tweet, which normally I hate reporting on tweets, but again, I do trust Quarry and would imagine this makes sense from a political standpoint, especially if Mullin is coming out against a 2024 Trump run. It will have big ramifications. And if this was passed, the UFC is in big trouble. And we'll get to that. But as to, I guess, again, answer the question why now of all times and why we're hearing it in this method. You have to be very careful in politics, right? As a father or rather as a son whose father is a political scientist and top poli sci, like timing is a huge part of politics. So we'll see what happens with it. But that's why it's being reintroduced now and being talked about now. Whether it actually makes it on the docket in 2023, I think is going to come down to just how far Trump's power seems to be fading come January. But yeah, I'm not sure where that will stand. If Trump suddenly bounces back in political polls, if you see him get kind of a resurgence, then my guess is this doesn't hit the Senate floor. If he is attempting to make his way back, but it's clear that the party is ready to move on from him, then this might be one of the first bits of legislation introduced in 2023. Can't say that for certain, but that would be my guess, is look at where Trump is polling amongst Republicans specifically come early 2023 to see when this will actually make it to the Senate floor, if it's actually coming back. Because again, right now, we just have the word of Markwayne Mullin. He might change his mind. Other things might come up. We'll see. So now we move on to the likelihood of this passing. Let's say this does hit the floor. The fact that it would most likely have bipartisan support, right? Since Mullin, again, is a Republican, he's not working exclusively with Democrats here. He's talked about working across the aisle on this way back in 2014, 15. One would assume that this has a solid shot of passing. If it makes it through the Senate, which is more, it's in Democratic control right now, that's not shocking. If they're able to get enough votes in the House to get it, however, then that seals the deal. And again, I think that all comes down to what reps want to do in the House in terms of challenging Trump's authority, because I cannot imagine from a political point of view that if you were a Republican representative in the House of Representatives and you signed this bill, that it wouldn't be perceived by Trump and his allies as you're on the other side. Again, not trying to go too far into politics here, but that would be my guess. Then it would come down to whether or not President Biden would sign off on it. I can't imagine he wouldn't, right? Again, we're talking about really crippling a business that came out in full force of your 2020 opponent, and there's no indication that there's any sort of dialogue between the Biden administration and Endeavor and Dana White and the UFC. Hard to think that Biden would reject signing it for some reason. So I'm going to say that if it gets introduced, especially early 2023, I'm going to say there's a solid chance this passes, because Republicans also won a very narrow majority in the House of Representatives. So it's not like you need to pull in, 20 or 30 reps. I think you only need 10 or so, probably. You want to have some backups because there might be some Democrats that go against it. Who knows? But it would not take much, because I can't imagine Democrats are going to look at this and not be for it too, right? They're going to look at this as an expansion of workers' rights, which they are pounding the table for right now on their platforms. I think this gets passed. If it gets passed, this shakes up things way more than the antitrust lawsuit. This would reshape the sport in multiple ways. If you're a fighter and you think this thing is going to get passed, right? You are looking to preserve your health first and foremost, right? You want to extend your career as long as possible and make sure that you are able to compete post passage of this legislature. And mind you, it will still take a year or two probably to actually be put into effect and all of that. It's not, I can't imagine it's going to be so high up that they immediately introduce it, they sign it, it's all good, right? Like that's rarely how things go in Congress. On some things, they can move that fast. If it's truly that bipartisan, I don't think this will be one of them. I think this will take a while to get through both sides and then get signed. But if you think that this is actually happening, and you'll be able to, I would imagine, have a good guess based on when it's introduced, the senators that come out and for it, especially the amount of Republican senators that come out and for it, and any other Republican reps outside of Mark Wayne Mullen that come out for it in the House, you'll probably have a good idea of if the legislation is going to make it or not. And if you think it is, and you're a fighter, short term, you're not taking any risky fights. You're making sure that you get to the other side of when that becomes a law. Because once that becomes a law, you have far more leverage than you've ever had as a fighter. Easily. Especially if you're top ranked or you're a champion, you have so much leverage. It's ridiculous compared to what you used to. You are just trying to make it to the other side. Short term, you're also trying to build up your name, though, right? You're probably trying to get into the UFC if you're not there already, and you're trying to take bigger name fights and get up the rankings as fast as possible. It's a hard balance, right? Make sure you're healthy, but then also if you're outside of the top 15 in the UFC or Bellator, right? Top 10 Bellator, or, PFL tournament, that's harder. Obviously, just got to be in the tournament, but one championship rankings, you want to be in the rankings somewhere from one of these promotions, because once they have independent bodies come out and then start ranking people, if you're already in a promotion's rankings, you're going to have a huge advantage from where you start. And it's going to be less fights to get to the contender or championship bout that you want, that will give you way more money than you've ever thought about having. So fighters are looking to get into the rankings at whatever promotion and stay healthy. From a promotional side of things, you are in a completely different boat. If you're the UFC, man, you are livid, probably. The ramifications of that on Endeavor stock too, and everything that would happen if that passed, Endeavor stock would tank. It would be a bad time for the UFC and Endeavor, because right now, as we've talked about on this podcast, they have the scarcity resources, right? They have that competitive advantage that they've been just building and building and building, where not only do they have cost dynamics in terms of, what they're able to bring at what price they're able to bring, but they also are in possession of the scarcity resources of the top fighters in the world, the most top fighters in the world, right? We know that Bellator and PFL M1 has some of the top fighters in the world, but UFC by far has the most of that limited resource. And the minute this thing passes, suddenly that's no longer valid. You would have multiple people that were top contenders, but maybe didn't win the belt or were up and coming, right? Immediately look to jump ship to a championship fight under whoever's promotion and belt, because they'll make way more money. You also wouldn't have all of those fighters under the same length of contract where they've got to be there for at least 5 years, right? We know that starting in 2017, they added the 5-year sunset clause, which is a huge step, but that's still 5 years. So it's a long, long time. And not common at all in what you see in, say, boxing, where the Ali Act is present. So you're really looking at a just massive shift in fighter leverage, especially amongst those champions and top 5 fighters. And the UFC would lose a lot of those guys, right? You do have people that want to be the best, of course, and they're going to say, yep, we're going to stay with the UFC, or we're going to challenge for this particular UFC champion because of that, et cetera, of course. But over time, that would fade because suddenly you would see some of the best, I guess, would be Ngannou, probably Jones, given all the contract issues he's had with the UFC. You'd see some of these guys leave and go make crazy money elsewhere. I'm sure you'd see McGregor leave. You'd see, pretty much anybody that's at the top of their game start getting into bidding wars for their fights. And the UFC would have to go from, hey, you're the flyweight champ, Davison Figueiredo, and we are paying you $300K with no pay-per-view points, to, okay, you've won a couple fights and had some wars with Moreno. Yes, we'll give you pay-per-view points. No, that wouldn't even be a thing. They'd immediately lose the right to promote a Figueiredo match against someone. And suddenly the low fixed costs and low variable costs that the UFC has had for the past, 5, 10 years are all immediately gone. They'd still have the media rights contract with ESPN until that went up in 2025, 2026. But I mean, it's going to be that much harder to renew rights, especially at the price that they'd be looking for, because suddenly a ton of big name fighters would jump elsewhere. Meanwhile, if you're Bellator, your PFL, your one championship, right, you're ecstatic. If you're PFL, you're probably the happiest because that's hypothetically the easiest way to say you're going to have the best fight the best by having the tournament format. I'm not exactly sure how that would work with the Ali Act in place, but hypothetically, you could still set up the tournament format and anyone could join that wanted to. And then you don't have to worry about mandatories and other things because you've got the tournament set up and you can kind of roll with that. Whether or not a mandatory would come up in between the finals or some other, there's a lot of big ifs with that. But hypothetically, if you're PFL, you're the greatest benefit and you are ecstatic that happens. If you're Bellator or One, you're still very happy, or Rizin, you're still very happy because you are now in a scenario where you can have a Bellator champion fight a UFC champion. In fact, it may be ordered to do so by the independent governing body. And suddenly, if you're, Bellator champion, if, I'm just, who off the top of my head would make sense? Nemkov. That's an easy one. If Nemkov ends up fighting whoever's going to end up at light heavyweight, let's say it's Jiri, right? And ends up beating Jiri, suddenly Bellator is going to be able to boast and say, look, man, our fighters are better than the UFC's. And it's going to garner attention from the UFC casual only fans. And they're going to say, whoa, this guy just beat Jiri and now he's fighting over in Bellator. Well, I got to watch him. So on and so forth. Meanwhile, if Nemkov goes over, fights Jiri and Jiri smokes him, well, that's kind of the expectation, right? We'll talk about more about this with the Rizin versus Bellator brand versus UFC brand segment here in a second. But right now, it's kind of expected from the casual UFC viewer that anybody that came from another promotion would get smoked. If you have another promotion's champion come over and beat a UFC champion, that's a whole nother realm of thought. That suddenly makes a dent in the UFC brand, which is huge. So if you're honestly any other promotion other than the UFC, you're jumping for joy if this thing passes. Now, is it still going to be hard to put on the fights you want and make money because you'll have to bid for certain things? Yes, of course. Especially because at the start, I would imagine endeavor in the UFC would probably have the greatest monetary power to have the highest purse bids, et cetera, et cetera. So you'd still have a lot of UFC exclusive-ish fights, but it also lowers the barrier to entry. So all promoters would be a little hesitant because suddenly anybody who's got money can come in, start a promotion very easily, and hypothetically put on amazing fights, a la Triller, right? Triller did it with a substitute sport in boxing, but imagine if Triller had the ability to come in and do that for MMA. And without the way MMA contracts work, because we saw exactly what happened with Triller, right? Where suddenly Jake Paul is able to fight there, and then he gets out of his contract, moves on, etc. But you still got a ton of buzz generated around Paul and his fight with Woodley and Askren. Askren was the Triller one, but you get what I mean. Imagine if they could do that with Conor and somebody. Any company could come in and do that. And mind you, Triller has made no money and is currently in trouble, but any kind of startup company could come in and say, look, we can put on these amazing fights. We'll get Conor McGregor versus somebody. It'll be awesome. And they'll totally be able to do that. That's huge. So if you're a promotion, you are looking to pump up your guys as much as you possibly can right now if you think the legislation is being passed. And the minute it's passed, you're trying to set up cross-promotional fights before other new entrants come into the market, especially before new entrants get into the market, right? If you're Bellator, you're trying to do Nemkov ordered against whoever ends up with the UFC belt ASAP. You're trying to build up your brand as one of the superior ones, and you're trying to ink a deal with who you think would be a star and who could beat the other champions, because ultimately that's what it would come down to. If you think Nemkov is the best light heavyweight in the world, your Bellator, you throw a ton of money at him and you worry less about the other champions. And then when he goes over and beats Jiri and then beats whoever's in Rizin and at PFL and so on and so forth, then you're making a ton of money because you're showing Nemkov's fights, right? That's the idea. And yes, you're not making anywhere near as much money as you would if you were the UFC, but you're still making a lot of money in those scenarios. That's your main goal. You're trying to find your homegrown stars that you want to pit up against other promotions, which Rizin and Bellator have a slight edge on already, right? Which we'll talk about here in a sec. But yeah, that's what you do if you're a promotion other than the UFC. You're just trying to find your homegrown star. You're trying to brace for the impact. You're probably looking at cutting multiple fighters and throwing money at who you think would be your top guys so that they can go out, fight other promotions, champions or stars, and hopefully come back bringing you more money than whatever you were able to do before. If you're the UFC, you're trying to hold on to as many stars as possible. You're navigating a very rough media deal if that's not already signed before this is passed. So if this happens, say this is somehow passed in 2024 and the media rights deal is coming up in 2025, you are desperately trying to get that deal done before it comes up, knowing you're going to take a hit on the revenue side. And then you are doing a huge reevaluation of your business model because you just lost your competitive advantage, your biggest competitive advantage. And given cost dynamics and how they're raising pay-per-view prices, you're probably need to just change most of your strategy, long-term competitive strategy. It's all hands on deck if you're the UFC. It's a nightmare, an absolute nightmare if you're the UFC. So I know that was a bit of a ramble, but it was important we dove into all that. Let me know if you have any questions on this. Let me know your thoughts. Would you like to see the Ali Act introduced? I know a lot of people are saying, no, I hate it. I hate the way boxing is now. I like the UFC makes the best fight the best and the promotion has that power. Is that what you want to see as a fan? Do you think that there's a way to preserve that structure should the Ali Act be introduced? lot of people I've talked to have said it might be possible to preserve some semblance of the current structure, even with the Ali Act. Is that possible in your opinion? Would you like to see that if that's possible? So that way you would be forced to see a Jiri versus Nemkov or a Rufian Stotts versus who is Aljamain Sterling, right? Would you prefer that method? What's your ideal scenario here as a fan? I would love to hear that because there's a legit chance this could get passed. There's a very legitimate chance, and may need to start thinking about it. All right, next up, we need to talk about Rizin versus Bellator and why it still can't compete with the UFC brand. So you've got essentially champion versus championship fights, what we were just talking about with the Ali Act, right? December 31st between Rizin and Bellator, which is huge. They've never done this type of champ v champ card. We've seen it done in one weight class, right? With Horiguchi and bantamweight, but we've not seen it done at this level. I mean, we're talking the top stars versus the top stars. This is any hardcore MMA fan's dream, in my opinion. I'm very excited for this card. It's going to be nuts to watch. And yet, still not seeing a ton of marketing, a ton of media attention on it. You had Josh Thompson from Bellator once again come out and say, is media going to do their job and cover this, etc. There's stuff out there, don't get me wrong, and I'm sure as it gets closer, we will see it. But, it's the last big card of the year at this point, right? There's no more UFC cards. I don't believe there's any more KSW, or if there is, it's not going to be as big as Poods versus Kadylov, right? No big cards left from other promotions. PFL's done. No big one cards, I believe. This is the biggest MMA card left in 2022. And yet you have media doing their year-end awards already. You have a lot of, talk about UFC stuff or UFC fighters. I mean, if I'm going to just real time right now, just going to go to a couple of pages here. So you've got discussions around Paulo Costa's negotiations, the UFC pay-per-view price, criticism on Doug Crosby. All right, let's try another one. Not going to say which publications they are, but they're all the big ones. You know what I'm talking about. Same type of thing. You have, Volk saying next year will be amazing. This is the type of stuff you're seeing. It's interesting. If you go to slightly lesser sites, you're talking still about UFC rankings, top subs and KOs, what's going on with Sean O'Malley. McGregor tweets. We are close to this massive, massive card. And again, it will get more attention as we get closer. But yet, still a fair amount of silence. And it's technically not fight week for it, right? So that's part of it. And it's the holidays, sure. So there's that. But something that needs to be driven home to a lot of the hardcore fans like myself is that in the grander scheme of things, you have to remember that the UFC is its own behemoth. It is so far and above Bellator, Rizin, One, PFL, all of that. It's not even funny, right? We've seen brands collaborate before in multiple industries where you'll have a crossover between I don't know, Fortnite and Spider-Man, right? Or Rick and Morty and multiple products, right? I think Old Spice is one that comes to mind. And it's like, oh, okay, here's a collab here, here's a collab. Like brand collaboration has always been a thing, especially when they're complementary brands, right? They're not in the same space. But when you have two brands that are technically direct competitors collaborating, it almost always means one thing, and that is that they are trying to enhance their brand name and image to compete with one, two, or three, what have you, larger, much larger players in the market. It's all about trying to get a little bit more of the marketing share, right? Because otherwise, why would you ever ask your direct competitor to, try and help you? You would never see Pepsi and Coke collaborate on, making a special soft drink together or having a vote for which one is the best contest, right? You always had the blind taste tests where one company would say they chose theirs, the other company would say they chose theirs, blah, blah, blah. You would never have them be like, hey, we're going to do this thing where we're going to announce which company sold more of, Diet Pepsi versus Diet Coke, which sold more in December, and then the winners declared, right? I mean, I know I'm reaching a little bit with the analogy, but you get what I'm saying. You never see those two ask each other for help unless there was, say, a third beverage company that was just so much bigger, that and bigger to the point where they're just trying to get noticed, right? That's when you see this type of collaboration. That's what's happening with Rizin and Bellator. It's outside of the hardcore MMA world, right? Where we watch a ton of, there ranges from, hey, I heard McGregor's on and never talk about MMA again, to Caposa, right? Where you're watching, I mean, that man is a savant when it comes to watching just ungodly amounts of MMA. That's your fan range, but that's also your marketing range, right? There's only one Caposa. There are literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of, oh, McGregor's fighting, and they have no idea about anything else. And the truth of the matter is that even some of these fight night cards that we've seen, right, where they have not been the caliber of 2015, 2016, anything pre-Endeavor, right, or early Endeavor, while they haven't been that caliber, you still see way more attention on them. And that's partially because in media, you're getting way more views and clicks. We talked about this on the podcast where I mentioned, kind of how media fits in the MMA space. You've got to go where the clicks are. And you're seeing things on those sites that are getting clicks. Rizin versus Bellator, at least right now, not so much. There will be a push. There will be coverage of it. But this is a marketing awareness tactic is really what it is. And it's the coolest way to do this marketing awareness tactic, right? Because you're going to have champ v champ, and you're going to have this whole thing. And Rizin originally, remember, is a fighting federation. It was intended to kind of do this, especially with Japanese promotions, right? You'll see Pancrase or Deep champions compete in Rizin. That was kind of part of its purpose. But to do this type of crossover, it's all about brand awareness. And they still pale in comparison to a Cannonier Strickland card, right? Or a Jessica I, a Jessica I headliner card, right? That's crazy to say, because who wouldn't want to see some of these fights that Rizin and Bellator are putting on, right? Who wouldn't want to see some of them versus a Jessica I, Cynthia Calvillo card? I would imagine the betting man would say that Rizin Bellator is going to be more action, more fun, all of that. And yet, the brand awareness is not there. UFC's brand is so dominant. It just envelops the entire MMA world. Still in 2022, and I'm sure in 2023, you still have people that say, "Oh, I watch UFC," or "Yeah, I'm a like UFC fan," and they equate it with MMA. Do you train UFC? I train UFC. Still hear that, which is nuts. But that's the truth. That's the cold, hard truth of this. So while I will be ecstatic to watch the New Year's Eve event, and I know a lot of you hardcores will as well, got to keep that in perspective. That's why we're not seeing a ton of coverage. That's why Josh Thompson is saying, is the media going to do their job? That's just him trying to rile up the media to get attention, because that's what this is. This is a, hey, check out this crazy thing we're doing. Look at it. It's not the same level of crazy as Fight Circus, which was also amazing. If you didn't see Fight Circus 5 or 4, highly recommend it. But it is a marketing ploy at its core. Whether it works or not, we'll see. Maybe it will increase searches. You'll know because a lot more media outlets will be covering more Bellator, more Rizin stuff in 2023 as compared to 2022 if it truly drives more customer acquisition. But if not, well, they'll just keep finding ways to try and grow the brands, because that's what it's all about. Brand recognition. I've had people tell me that some of the insights I have are awesome and, you know, and it's flattering and all that, sure. But like, there are things I've talked about on here that then eventually make their way into the mainstream, and people have been like, well, you talked about it before then. Well, yeah, but I mean, I'm here. I'm not Luke Thomas. I'm not Ariel Helwani. I'm not these bigger name people. I don't have the brand recognition. That's how it works. Let me know if you're excited for the Rizin Bellator card. Let me know for your favorite fight, and especially let me know, what do you think are creative ways that Rizin and Bellator can collaborate to get even greater brand awareness, right? Is this the pinnacle, champ v champ? I mean, this is something we've all been wanting. If you've been following this for a while, we've been wanting it, and it's going to be awesome. But can they top this come 2023, 2024? Let me know your thoughts on it, because exciting stuff, but still, unfortunately, needs to get out into the casual space more, in my opinion. All right, calling an audible here. We're going to go to the fan question, maybe circle back to quick hits depending on time. But fan question comes from Tan Nguyen. I believe that's how you say your last name. If it's not Tan, let me know. But big fan of the show, longtime listener, appreciate him. And he asked if I could cover this on the podcast. I wanted to cover it last week, couldn't get to the full thing. Talked about Ariel and Patty in some of the situation, but specifically he asked, should fighters get a cut for media appearances, especially if media is monetizing the fighters? This is a great question, because I saw a lot of backlash, especially from the media, right? Like asking a media member to pay for a fighter to do an interview. What's that about? I will say I've never paid for an interview with a fighter, right? I haven't done many, but the ones I have never been asked to pay, and I've never paid. I have not heard of that happening very much at all. I think Pimblett is the first time I've heard about it. So I will, from my limited experience, back up what Ariel said there. But this question is still important, because should fighters get a cut for media appearances if the media is monetizing them? Now, we know, right, as we talked about, that clicks are and views are a huge driver of money here. And especially with the rise of YouTube and video format, you can make a lot of money if you have a viral video, right? You can get a lot of subscribers. You can make a lot of money if you monetize it just from one particular video. Even at the Body Lock, when I was there doing those, and we were a smaller channel, every once in a while we would, hit a topic that would just take off through the SEO, and that particular video would make us way more money than the rest of the videos we were putting out. And yes, it was a small amount for us, but still, it goes to show that, yeah, if you're talking about a particular fighter, or if you have a fighter interview, it could change the game monetarily. Not to mention how it could boost your brand as a media outlet or journalist. So the question becomes, should fighters get a cut for media appearances? Here's the thing. Media appearances are a roll of the dice, though, right? If I ask Pimblett for an interview, or I don't know, any up and coming guy, it's a complete roll of the dice. If I asked a more established UFC fighter, okay, a little bit less, right? If I get Khamzat Chimaev in an exclusive interview, based on the numbers you're able to see from his previous interviews and just his SEO search, you can tell you're probably going to make something there. If you get Conor McGregor for a sit down, obviously that's going to probably be a mega booster for you. Yet the purpose of the media, or should be, as we've talked about, if you're truly doing journalism, is it's supposed to be the fifth estate independent review, right? It's supposed to be a platform for a fighter to answer questions, voice their concern, boost their own brand through a particular way. That's why, for example, fighters often choose through their agents or through themselves which platforms they actually speak on. And it's a touchy subject, right? NFL stuff. I know you just had the Giovanni Bernard interview not that long ago, where it was had that demanding reporter who was super entitled, saying like, you're supposed to give us answers contractually. That's part of the reason why the NFL puts it in your contract. You have to answer the media, because a lot of those guys wouldn't do it. But with UFC, it's the same type of deal. UFC has contractual things that say you have to talk to the media or do certain media appearances, and you're not allowed to get out of it. We saw McGregor try, didn't happen. We saw Rousey get out of it for her return because the UFC let them out, or let her out rather. But it's good for the sport and for the promoter if big name fighters are making their rounds, right? Also hypothetically good for the fighter. They're boosting their name, their reputation. They're maybe going viral with goofy answers. Who knows? It's possibly getting them out there too, right? Any viral video that happens, even if it's with a small name like me, if it's viral, it's going to help the fighter too, right? So I believe that it shouldn't be monetized, but I also believe that fighters should be able to choose, which they are for the most part, sans press conferences that the UFC holds, or if the UFC has particular, championship obligations, right? Sans that, where you're really doing it more as an ambassador for a promoter, I believe that any fighter should be able to say no to any interview they want. And that should just be how it is. I mean, that's how media works. In order to keep it truly more on the journalistic side, even though it's not there now in MMA media, but to keep it close enough to that so that it still is independent and people can ask harder questions and all this other stuff, you got to keep money out of that. Because otherwise you're going to see fighters only doing interviews with, barstool guys, or think about it. Rich guys could just come in, and if they really wanted to interview fighters, they'd be like, cool, like, let's do this. They still hypothetically could, but it would change the landscape so much. It would take out a lot of journalistic integrity and kill aspiring journalists, because there are still a few people that are trying to be true journalists in this space. And I think the sport is better off with them in it. But yeah, from a business perspective, messing with that dynamic could lead to so many unintended consequences too. I think the UFC would rather, just keep it to how it is, where, hey, you've got to do our post-fight press conferences. If you're champ, you probably have to do certain media appearances. We might ask you to do media appearances, right? We know Anthony Smith has talked about this. He gets asked to do a meet and greet or certain things, like, great, but they're not obligated. But you don't have to, right? If Sherdog says we need an interview request with this person, a fighter is not forced to do it, right? At least like a one-on-one interview. If it's at the Fighter Media Day or other stuff, sure. But they outside of that normal fight week obligations, they shouldn't have any, and I believe that's true. But yeah, you gotta keep them separate. It would shift so many things in the business landscape, and it would also hurt the promoters because they'd have less control, right? You could have fighters pick and choose and kind of build up these brands that maybe promoters don't want built up, but fighters don't care because they're getting paid to do these interviews. It becomes a whole thing. Or you've got the fighters going to hang out with Kadyrov situation, right? Shooting guns and sparring with Kadyrov's son, like Garbrandt did. I mean, those optics aren't great. And now you've got a whole like focus on UFC fighters going and hanging out with a, Chechnyan warlord who has talked about wanting to nuke everybody. Like, not a good time, because then you get mainstream media involved and it looks bad for your promotion and sport. It's a whole thing. So I think that was a great question, and I think it needed to be discussed. Let me know your thoughts on it. Do you believe fighters should get a cut for media appearances, especially if media is monetizing it, right? So we're not talking about, oh, it's going to be a free YouTube thing. We're not monetizing the video, etc. If, say, I did an interview with any star in the sport and monetize that video, should a fighter get a cut? I'd love to hear your thoughts and your just everything about this subject. I think it's an interesting question. It's not talked about enough. Let me know your thoughts. All right, going for a new record on the quick hits. Only going to cover two, and going to be super quick because I got other things I want to talk about. The NAC chairman has resigned, so the Nevada Athletic Commission's chairman has stepped down. Is it going to change anything? I really don't think so, based on the way that Nevada kind of works and their relationship with MMA promotions, specifically the UFC. I think the chairman stepping down is interesting, but I don't think it's going to really change anything. Don't think it's related to the betting scandal either. That could be false. Maybe it is, but at this point, I have no reason to believe that based on people I've talked to. Then the other thing is the UFC becomes the Iowa Hawkeyes men's and women's wrestling program sponsor. So UFC is kind of stepping into the NIL space. I talked about this a little bit on a previous podcast. Makes sense, especially if you're looking to get some homegrown talent and make stars. How much they'll dive into this, I don't know. I expect them to go after things like wrestling programs or kind of niche sports or clubs that won't cost them a ton of money to sponsor, but yet could still yield visibility into the sport at colleges, right? That's a key age range to try and make new fans. And then especially if you get somebody who's like a good collegiate wrestler moving into the UFC, like Bo Nickel, we'll see where he goes. But I think he's kind of a test pilot where if he starts to draw people and all that stuff, it could be a real big thing. So yeah, makes a lot of sense. That's the only quick hits I have. Let me know if I missed anything crucial, but I think that pretty much covers it. I don't know that I beat the record. I'm going to say I did. I'm just going to say I did, I think. Keep me honest on that if I did, but I think I did. All right. Next, we're going to talk about good business, bad business. You could say good deal, bad deal here with the UFC raising pay-per-view prices yet again, starting in 2023 at UFC 283. It will now cost $79.99 if you're in the States for a UFC pay-per-view, as opposed to $74.99 this past year. To give you a reference point, in 2014, pay-per-view prices were $44.95 for standard def and then $54.95 for high def. But $44.95 in 2014. We have now almost doubled that in the span of 8-9 years. So not terrible, but not great. However, between 2014 and 2019, pay-per-view price was $59.99. In the past 2 years, really, 2-3 years, it's jumped from $59.99 to $79.99. So 33% increase approximately from 2014 to 2019, 5-year span, doing that again in half that time. Hypothetically, less than half that time. I think so. Based on when those increases hit, I think that's correct. That's a major jump. We've talked about UFC pay-per-view numbers, how they've been affected by the price increases. We also know that according to Journal, We don't have any other numbers for the rest of the year past May, but we know that 400K was kind of the top for Gaethje Oliveira at UFC 274. So anything preceding that was less than 400K buys. This is not going to help that. It's definitely not. But before we pass judgment here on whether this is good business, bad business, because I know a lot of you right now through social media and just reaching out to me have already said this is terrible. I'm definitely illegally streaming, or I'm figuring out a way to get these cheaper, which I hear you. I do. But before we pass final judgment on this, I think it's important to take a step back and examine why they are raising the prices again. So for those of you that haven't been following the saga, Disney, which is ESPN's parent company, has been undergoing some turmoil in 2022. You had Bob Iger, who was a beloved CEO, ran Disney very well for quite a long time, stepped down during the pandemic, and his handpicked replacement, Bob Chapek, came in. And it was a weird transition where Iger and Chapek were there at the same time, and Iger was still technically Chapek's boss for like a year or 9 months or something. And then Chapek finally was let go to, not like let go fired. That did happen eventually, but really Iger completely stepped out of the way, and Chapek was left to run the company his way. And he quickly lost favor amongst the board as well as several key executives. There's a great Wall Street Journal podcast about this, talking about the kind of Sunday night coup, because that's what it was, right? We got word of this on Sunday night, not too long ago, just kind of out of the blue. Nobody saw this coming. But Chapek has done a pretty awful job politicking at Disney, and also sustained pretty heavy losses in 2022 for Disney. You had theme parks having a lot of issues and not being maintained the way that they normally are. You had Chapek come out on political issues in Florida, which normally Disney kind of stays in the background for that. So it kind of drew the ire of certain people. Streaming losses, including ESPN Plus and Disney Plus, were far worse than they appeared to be on the surface. Just the Q4 earnings call and the end of the year 2020 call was not good. It was very, very bad. And Chapek painted everything as a rosy picture. He talked about how great everything was. He used the word phenomenal a million times. And there was a dissonance between what the CFO was saying, like, hey, here are the numbers, here are where we are, and Chapek saying everything's all rosy and great, and it's all good. Eventually, this leads to the CFO making a phone call and really going out on a limb to ask Iger to come back. And Iger says yes. And Bob Iger is now the new CEO of Disney and is trying to right the ship. But Chapek's damage here has been monetary, right? Disney stock is down significantly compared to where it was during its high in the pandemic. And streaming services in particular took heavy losses. Parks, even though they've been reopened now, Chapek raised ticket prices kind of nonstop on that, and it caused a bunch of issues. Disney's trying to make that money back, right? This is a all hands on deck Disney to right the ship. If you're getting Iger to come back as CEO only a couple years after he left, you're in a pretty bad situation optically. But from what we know from Wall Street Journal reporting, also it is all hands on deck to correct the mess that Chapek kind of steered them into. I believe this is part of that, right? I believe they've looked at certain key price points and data and said, you know what? I think we can get some more out of this. And again, I don't know how much the UFC is consulted here. The way my understanding is, the way that the deal is structured between UFC and ESPN is who gets to set it, right? Because they're making the immediate 500, 400K buys or whatever, and then the UFC is getting their on top of that. Now, it's not the UFC isn't getting a revenue increase when the price increases based on how that all works. But nevertheless, it's more of ESPN's decision than UFC's, from my understanding. Providing that assumption is correct, this again is all about getting Disney back on track. Will this hurt pay-per-view buys? Of course. They're going to continue to drop lower. The fact we didn't hear any numbers outside of Oliveira Gaethje lets me think that probably is the highest pay-per-view on the UFC side this year. Maybe there is higher on, we had a couple, Izzy Pereira. You had a couple bigger shows. Makhachev versus Oliveira could easily have made it past 400K, but you definitely didn't have any blow you out of the water numbers. And I don't think, even if there was something that broke the Gaethje Oliveira record, I don't think it was by that much. I know you've got numbers out there again from all sorts of people just touting wrong numbers. It's hard because you got to stay away from them. But my belief is it's probably 400, maybe 500K is the best what you had in 2022, and that will only drop in 2023. Would not be shocked if 350 to 300 was your top range in 2023. Sans a McGregor comeback, right? That's the only way I see them trending higher. But other than that, I think you're pretty much left with lower pay-per-view buys, because people were already complaining about $75. You're squeezing people even more while inflation has still risen. You're going to see a lot more illegal streaming. I'm sure you'll see people cracking down on it too, right? But still, I think you'll see more illegal streaming. I think you'll see a lot more VPNs. There are other methods to watch pay-per-views, and it's becoming increasingly more enticing to ignore paying the full pay-per-view price per time. To my fellow media members that have to buy it legitimately, I feel for you. I really do, because it's gonna just keep hurting your pocketbook. Maybe I would say ask for a raise, but I'm not sure how that would go over depending on where you're working. But yeah, it's rough. That all being said, is this a good deal or a bad deal? Ultimately, I think this is, from a promotion and media side, Disney side, I think it's a good deal, because I think despite the fans you're going to lose from the price point really being a too much for them, right? There's still enough hardcores out there that I think you're going to end up making more money. Right? There is a break-even point in terms of the amount of buys it takes that you lose, and then the extra $5 increase, right? Where, okay, if I raise the price by $5 and get, I don't know, let's say, for example, 20,000 less buys, it's the same as if I had kept the same price and had 20,000 more buys, right? I'm not saying 20,000 is the number, but you get what I'm saying. Basic economics here, where there is a break-even point, a market equilibrium. I think that they have not quite hit the equilibrium, and that this will push it there, but I think they will still end up making more money from a Disney standpoint than if they kept the $75. And I trust that Auger has come in and they've done the research, especially with how much money the streaming division was hemorrhaging. I would imagine it's not always the case, even with big companies. Lord knows I've worked for some of them, but I would imagine they've probably done the research to kind of verify that, where they have some indication of, yes, we can raise it by $5, and yes, we're going to lose this many buys. We're still going to end up with more money. From the UFC standpoint, again, depending on the way it works with their contract, they may not like it, because it may be on a certain number of buys, regardless of price, that they get their extra bonus per buy, right? If that's the case, they're probably unhappy with this. Although they could renegotiate part of it. It's hard to say. And they'll still make a ton of money from, a McGregor pay-per-view or any of the big stars. From a fan standpoint, of course, it sucks, right? And fighter standpoint too. You're probably it's that much harder to sell pay-per-views if you're a fighter now. And it is unlikely that the fighter contracts have been amended to say, oh, you now get, $3 per buy instead of $2 at this particular level, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's rough go for the fighters, but I think it's a good business overall, or a good deal overall for media, bad for everybody else. Good for Disney, bad for everybody else. That's my take on it. Let me know if this is the price point that's pushed you too far, if you're going to reserve your buys for just premium cards, what your stance is on all this. Because, yeah, I told you it could come sooner rather than later. Unfortunately, it's come much, much sooner. And I don't know that this will be the last one. It's going to really depend on how Disney does in first half of 2023, in my opinion. All right, last thing we're covering, and we're going to make it super quick because I've already gone too long, but appreciate you listening as always. Predictions for 2023. What do I think the big business predictions are? I'm doing this because I stupidly, with very little sleep, saw a Sports Business Journal tweet and article about biggest predictions, and I thought that the UFC had already renewed with ESPN ahead of time, and they were going till 2023. I think I tweeted about it. Somebody was like, "Hey, man, by the way, that's just a predictions thing." So, big shout out to him for letting me know. But yeah, I thought, you know what, I should go ahead and give my own predictions here. So that's what I'm doing. Biggest predictions. I predict for 2023. We have a couple of things. One, I predict that Francis Ngannou does not come back to the UFC immediately. I do believe he's probably trying to work it out, but I think he's going to realize how much more money he can make in boxing, that a couple of other promotions are probably willing to throw a ton of money at him, even just for 1 or 2 fights, and that's probably worth it. I think yes, he wants the legacy and all that, but I think right now, all indications I have, my prediction is Francis Ngannou competes outside of the UFC in 2023. That's a big prediction I'm making. I also am going to predict you're going to see more big name fighters than ever before in 2023 that were under UFC contract go to other places. This will be the biggest year for MMA free agency so far. That is my prediction for 2023. Reason being, sunset clauses were put in 2017, first introduced right in that time frame. So a lot of them are coming due 2022, and early 2023, the first wave, so to speak. Ngannou's one of them. Costa just said he's not fighting Whitaker because he wanted more money, but his contract ends March something in 2023. I think you're going to see a ton of people follow this method, try and get more money elsewhere. I predict the biggest MMA free agency season ever, 2023, ever. It's going to be awesome. I don't think it's going to change the landscape where all of a sudden UFC loses all of their big guys or anything, but it's going to be massive. That's a huge prediction I'm doing too. I will also predict that, do I say this prediction or not? It's a bold one. It's a hot take prediction, but I've thought about it for a bit. I'm going to roll with it. I'm going to say that in 2023, this is the year that one championship goes under. I'm rolling with that. I am. I think this might be the year where they've got a lot lined up here with Amazon. They've got some other stuff going on. I'm going to amend that. I don't think they go under. I think they're going to be in the financially roughest position they've ever been in. I think their losses are going to be massive. If we get those numbers, I think it's going to be a whole thing. We'll see. We'll see how the Amazon deal pans out. They are getting sponsorships and making the right moves they need to, but how much they're spending still is concerning. And I don't know, especially with the macroeconomic environment, if that turns and investors are in trouble, this could be it. This could be the year. This could be the year. I don't know for sure, but that's my boldest prediction. That's a real hot take prediction there. And then lastly, my last prediction I want to make is that 2023 will also be the year where it will be the year of the Eastern Asian caucus fighter. I think this will be the year where, I mean, we've seen the rise of, right, Russian, Dagestan, Serbia, even, right? We've got a lot of people coming up. I think this is the year where it's just champions in so many weight classes are going to be all these guys training out from Dagestan, Russia. Russia will be tough, I guess, depending on what's going on with the whole war situation. But that being said, I think this is the year there where you will see them kind of dominate the space, and it will be interesting to see how businesses and promoters react, right? Sponsors, it could get weird, but I think this is the year where we're seeing a lot of champions from that region. And I think it's going to shift some of the business aspects given what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. I don't know that for sure. Again, that's more of a hot take one, but I think this might be the year that happens, and who knows? It just who knows? I will also say, not so bold prediction, UFC Africa is announced this year. I don't think it will happen in 2023 necessarily, but I think it will probably happen in 2024 and be announced this year. I think that's probably more of a safer one. That's pretty much all signs have been pointing to that, despite the fact that, Kamaru and Izzy, and I think even Ngannou will not be in the picture, at least in the immediate 2023. I still think UFC Africa is announced. I don't know where they will go, but I think that will get announced this year. So those are my big business predictions. Let me know what you think. If you have any other business predictions yourself, if you think I'm off on any of them, more than happy to hear them. I know I had a hot take one in there. Let me know. But yeah, that's where I'm at. So let me know on that one. All right, guys. Well, that wraps up the 2022 Business Extravaganza episode, final episode, Five Business Podcast for the year. I appreciate you guys watching so much. I know this was a long one, but I hope you guys have a wonderful holiday season if you celebrate. If not, I just hope you have a great rest of your 2022. We will be back in 2023, bigger, better than ever, more business stuff. Let me know if you want me to cover any particular segments, if you've got any topics you want me to cover, anything like that. Do you want me to do an award show? I was asked about that. Do you want me to do business award show as the first episode of 2023? If I see enough people saying, yeah, that'd be awesome, let me know. I would love to do that. You can also DM me too. You don't have to make it public if you don't want. You know how that is. But love you guys. Really appreciate you listening. And until 2023, get money.